Question 7. Is slavery endorsed in the Bible? If so, wouldn't this condone things like racism and abuse? Isn't it simply outdated? Passages from both the Old and New Testaments mention slaves and their masters. It seems there's only two choices. Either option 1, these stories are fictional and there is no God. Or option 2, these stories are true, therefore God must be hateful, heartless, and immoral. But are these really the only options? We have to make sure we're asking the right questions. The most common approach from skeptics comes in the form of a moral objection. In episode 6, we learned that atheists cannot objectively justify morality. In short, we asked what it would take for an atheist to be intellectually consistent in this regard. The standard for morality could be anything from what benefits the collective good, what is advantageous for survival, what the majority of people agree to, or even what makes the individual happy. But what do these standards have to say about things like rape, murder, etc.? Well, it wouldn't be wrong if it helps a majority of people. It also wouldn't be wrong if it promotes survival. Nothing is wrong if the majority agrees to it. And lastly, nothing is wrong if it makes me happy. Virtually zero atheists are intellectually consistent here. These subjective objections don't hold up against something that claims to be an objective standard. This approach essentially says, I just don't like it. A fair approach would be to question the coherency of the Bible by asking if it is consistent throughout its pages. So, do any passages contradict the just character of God described elsewhere? Understandably, we may see the term slavery and assume that we know what it means. We think it must be racially motivated, forced upon someone, and abusive. But the question we must ask is this: are these things actually in the text? The Old Testament claims to cover hundreds of years of history, and it is also where we will find a majority of the relevant passages for this question. This is what most people have in mind when they picture the term slavery. But is it possible our modern perception of slavery radically differs from the intended biblical usage? We can start by asking some simple questions. Were these people stolen? The book of Exodus tells us, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. Well, it at least had to be racially motivated, right? Israel and their surrounding nations were all inhabitants of a relatively small area in the ancient Middle East, meaning most of them likely had the same complexion. Furthermore, Israelites had Israelite slaves, so it couldn't be based on race or ethnicity. The book of Leviticus tells Israelites that they are to love foreigners as they love themselves. Lastly, Rahab the Canaanite is found in the genealogy of Jesus. That seems like something that would be left out if the author was concerned with race. Well, was this so-called slavery physically abusive? Exodus tells us that if the master did something as trivial as knocking out a tooth of his slave, the slave would get to go free. Also, the death penalty was in place for anyone who killed a slave. Paul Copan, author of Is God a Moral Monster?, has this to say: a mistake critics make is associating servanthood in the Old Testament with antebellum pre-war slavery in the South. An Israelite strapped for shekels might become an indentured servant to pay off his debt to a boss or employer, Adon. Calling him a master is often way too strong a term, just as the term ebed, servant, employee, typically shouldn't be translated slave. Remember, some laws were not perfectly ideal, but they were permitted for a time because of human stubbornness. Just because a historical event is described in the Bible doesn't mean it is prescribed by God. And for a more comprehensive discussion of challenging passages, see citation number 4. For perspective, how do Old Testament slave laws stack up against other laws throughout history? Hammurabi's Code from around 1700 BC has this to say: if anyone receives into his house a runaway male or female slave, and does not bring it out at the public proclamation, the master of that house shall be put to death. Fast forward to the U.S. Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Any person who shall knowingly and willingly obstruct seizing or arresting such fugitive from labor, or shall rescue such fugitive, shall forfeit and pay the sum of 500, about 13,000 in 2023, dollars. What does the Old Testament have to say? You shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst, in the place that he chooses, in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. As we've seen, slavery in the Bible is categorically different from the modern perception of slavery. It's often a voluntary means of escaping bankruptcy or poverty, and it is not concerned with race. So perhaps a more accurate translation would be indentured servitude. This is a Bible from 1807 that was given to slaves. Passages were removed that could potentially encourage rebellion. Now, the Protestant Bible contains 66 books. So how much did slave owners feel needed to be removed? The astoundingly reduced Slave Bible contains only parts of 14 books. All men, created alike in the image of God, are inseparably bound together. This is at the very heart of the Christian gospel. Segregation is a tragic evil that is utterly unchristian. The philosophy of Christianity is strongly opposed to the underlying philosophy of segregation.